Chapter 1. The Prologue of Prophecy. The clearing sat heavy beneath the blood-red moon, a wash of otherworldly light pooling like liquid over the mossy earth. Towering pines whispered their unease to one another, as if the forest itself recoiled from the unnatural glow staining the sky. At the clearing's center stood a lone figure, cloaked in black, their hood drawn low over their face. A staff, topped with an iridescent crystal, rested against their shoulder, catching flickers of crimson moonlight. The air was thick, humming with tension, as if the world were holding its breath. Slowly, deliberately, the figure traced a circle in the soft soil with the butt of the staff. A faint glow trailed the movement, outlining the crude circle until it shimmered faintly against the darkness. Around the edges, stones carved with runes, ancient symbols of the pack's oldest tongues, sat like silent sentinels. "Moon above, witness me," the seer intoned, their voice raspy, as though strained by the weight of long-forgotten words. The language, older than the trees surrounding them, carried a power that trembled in the very marrow of the forest. In one hand they held a silver dagger, its blade gleamed as if it too had drunk of the moon's sanguine light. With the other hand, they raised a weathered scroll, its ink fading and curling at the edges, yet still legible. The seer's chant grew stronger, reverberating off the trees, filling the clearing until even the tiniest woodland creatures fled. A wolf's howl rang out in the distance, mournful and raw, as if acknowledging the power surging through the clearing. As the chant peaked, the seer slashed the blade lightly across their palm, allowing a single drop of blood to fall into the circle. The instant the drop hit the soil, the air shifted, thickened. Shadows deepened, the wind stilled, and the faint glow of the runes flared bright, nearly blinding. The clearing felt alive, pulsating with the force of something ancient stirring from slumber. The blood-red moon's light intensified, the shimmering of the runes turning to a searing brilliance. In that moment, the figure froze, their hood slipping back slightly to reveal a face lined with age and etched with pain. Eyes wide, unseeing, they stood transfixed, caught in the grip of the prophecy unraveling before them. A deep, rumbling voice seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere. An alpha's heart will awaken, the moon's chosen will rise, but the shadows will feed. The voice faded into a whisper, lost to the rustle of branches and the creeping return of the forest's breath. The seer staggered, as though a great weight had just been lifted, or placed upon them. Their hand tightened on the staff, their voice reduced to a trembling whisper. And so it began. The clearing remained silent. The blood-red moon began its slow retreat, the light fading to a dull, more familiar silver. The forest breathed again, a gentle wind stirring the treetops, as if the night itself sought to erase what had just transpired. But the runes still glimmered faintly, their light refusing to fade completely. The ground remained marked, the soil forever stained with the prophecy's imprint. The seer pulled their hood back into place, obscuring their face once more, and limped back into the shadows. As their figure disappeared into the darkness, the runes pulsed one last time, a soft glow that seemed to sigh in resignation. The forest, now eerily quiet, seemed to lean inward as if listening, waiting. Because though the night had passed, the prophecy had only just begun. The seer's chant faltered as the runes in the soil blazed brighter, each glowing symbol throwing off wisps of silver light that curled upward like smoke. What had once been a simple vision, clear, precise, now fractured into fragments. Shadowy figures and half-formed images clawed at the edges of the elder's sight, tangling together like cobwebs. The clearing spun. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the seer fell deeper into the vision. There, a face emerging through the fog of stars. It was sharp, proud, and young, though lined with the faintest shadows of turmoil. The future Alpha, his storm-gray eyes, so vivid they seemed carved into the very fabric of the vision, burned with a power only just awakening. But they weren't fixed on the seer. No, those eyes locked onto another, one whose presence rippled through the vision like a dropped stone in still water. The destined mate. The seer tried to focus on her, but the image was slippery, elusive, a shimmer of moonlight hair, eyes glinting gold like a predator's, yet full of something softer, something unspoken. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of defiance and sadness, and she seemed to be reaching out, not to the seer, not to the Alpha, but to something unseen. The vision wavered, the scene trembling as if her very presence had shaken its foundations. A chanting voice in the seer's throat caught, as the vision twisted again. The Alpha's gaze darkened. Beside him, a shadow unfurled like black silk, spreading wide and menacing, only to take the shape of a man, or something like one. His features were blurred, a suggestion of cruel lines and gleaming, unnatural teeth, but his presence felt heavy, dominating, as if he were somehow larger than the scene around him. The seer could feel the weight of him, the way he seemed to push against the edges of the vision, threatening to unravel it entirely. A voice, low and mocking, reached through the haze. "It's not yours. It never was." The Alpha snarled, his storm-gray eyes narrowing. The destined mate's golden gaze flicked between them, caught between the shadows and the light, her stance a battlefield of hesitation and longing. The seer's heart pounded, the weight of it threatening to pull them from the vision altogether, but they had to see more, had to understand. The rival's shadow thickened, and the scene shifted again. A towering hall, walls draped in dark banners and silver chandeliers hung like predatory claws. The Alpha stood at one end, his chest heaving as though he'd just fought his way there. His destined mate was at the other, her arms crossed, her expression one of distant resolve. Between them stood the shadow, the rival, his form now solid, his grin sharp and cruel. He gestured carelessly to the banners overhead, which dripped black liquid like blood. The voice came again, mocking, daring. "You can't save her. You'll never even touch her." The Alpha lunged, claws flashing, but the scene fractured before impact. The seer gasped, their throat raw. They stumbled back a step, the vision's clarity already receding, fading into a jumble of images too fleeting to make sense of. The destined mate's face, the rival's grin, the Alpha's fury, all swirling into a storm of silver and black before vanishing completely. The clearing fell silent. The silver light dimmed, leaving only the faint, persistent glow of the runes etched in the dirt. The blood-red moon hung overhead, no longer menacing, but cold, distant, as if observing from another world. The seer's knees hit the ground, their staff falling beside them. "This isn't the ending," they whispered hoarsely to the silent trees. "It's the beginning." And somewhere, far from the clearing, where the light of the blood-red moon didn't reach, shadows began to stir. A gust of wind swept through the clearing, snuffing out the final embers of the ritual's light. The elder's voice faltered, then broke, the chant ending on a brittle note. For a moment, silence. Then the world seemed to exhale, the forest shifting uneasily as though disturbed by an unseen predator. The elders swayed on their feet, the staff trembling in their grip. Their breath came in sharp gasps, each one more strained than the last. They staggered a step forward, boots sinking into the soft earth, and fell to their knees with a muted thud. "A heart will awaken," they rasped. Their voice was thin now, barely more than a whisper, yet it cut through the night as if the words themselves carried weight. They doubled over, fingers clutching the soil like it could anchor them against the storm that had roared through their mind. But at what cost? As they collapsed fully, the forest seemed to withdraw. The trees leaned back into shadow. The low hum of insects faded into stillness. Even the blood-red moon, once so oppressive, softened its glare to a dull crimson glow. The elder lay motionless, the lines of their face etched in exhaustion. The staff rolled away, settling near the circle of runes that still pulsed faintly in the dark. But there was no more chanting, no more visions. Only the faint rustle of leaves overhead and the faint echo of their warning hanging in the air. A single owl called in the distance, its note sharp and short, almost startled. Then the forest swallowed the sound, returning to its quiet watch. The council chamber was suffocating. Low beams, dark wood walls, and a single window set high enough to let in moonlight without offering a view. It felt more like a crypt than a meeting hall, but perhaps that was fitting. The weight of the room matched the gravity of the discussion, and neither seemed interested in making things easier for him. Kaden leaned back in the oversized chair reserved for the alpha, his boots planted firmly on the polished floor, his hands gripping the chair's ornate arms. He wasn't the alpha yet, but they made him sit here anyway, surrounded by elders who looked at him like he was still a pup who hadn't learned to stand on two legs. "I'm telling you," one of them said, gray-haired and sharp-tongued, her voice rasping like bark against stone. "The rogues have breached our borders 3 times this month. The longer we wait to act, the weaker we look." Kaden's gaze flicked to the high window. The moon wasn't blood-red tonight, just pale and distant. A normal moon, yet he still felt the ritual's echo in his bones. He could still see that vision, that woman whose face he couldn't quite remember, and hear the seer's rasped warning, "A heart will awaken, but at what cost?" The cost, he realized bitterly, was likely his sanity. Or his patience. "We'll handle the rogues," Kaden said at last, his tone measured and cool. "But it's not just about fighting. We need to strengthen the borders. Reinforce the northern paths, double the patrols in the lowlands. If they sense weakness, it won't matter how many rogues we take down. They'll keep coming." A few of the elders exchanged glances. Disapproval? Agreement? It was hard to tell when they always wore the same expression. Stern, calculating, ancient. The sharp-tongued elder, Margaret, sniffed. Borders aren't strengthened by hesitation, boy. They're strengthened by dominance. You need to make them fear you." He didn't flinch, though he felt her words scrape against his already raw nerves. "We've tried fear. If that had worked, we wouldn't be here now." Someone else spoke. A younger voice, though still older than his. One of his father's former allies, maybe. Kaden didn't bother remembering their names. They all blurred together. "Your father—" "I'm not my father," Kaden interrupted, his voice low and steady. The words landed heavier than the elders seemed to expect. He saw them pause, weighing their next move. He hated when they invoked his father, the late alpha who'd ruled with an iron fist and a gaze that could turn wolves into whimpering pups. Kaden didn't want to rule like that. He didn't want to rule at all if he was being honest. But that wasn't a choice. The room fell silent, the air thick enough to choke on. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Probably just the wind, though it sounded louder, sharper. Even the forest seemed restless tonight. "I'll meet with the patrol captains at dawn," Kaden said, standing. He'd had enough of this claustrophobic council chamber and the endless loop of bickering. "We'll have a plan in place by midday." Margaret snorted but said nothing. The other elders stayed quiet too, watching as he turned and strode toward the door. He didn't slam it shut behind him, though he wanted to. Instead, he walked into the crisp night air, the scent of pine and damp earth grounding him. It was a relief to be out of that room, but the weight in his chest hadn't eased. The pack wanted strength, dominance, the sort of cold, brutal leadership his father had embodied, and maybe they needed it. Maybe the only way to protect them was to become the very thing he despised. Kaden tilted his head back, staring at the moon. No answers came, only the memory of that vision, her golden eyes gleaming in the dark. Her voice silent yet louder than anything the elders had said. "Who were you?" he thought, as if the moon might whisper the answer. But the night remained silent, and Kaden was left with only his questions and the distant howl of a wolf that didn't sound entirely friendly. The council chamber rang with raised voices, each elder speaking over the next. The sound was relentless, grating, like the gnawing of tree branches against a storm-worn roof. Kaden kept his posture upright, hands loosely gripping the arms of the Alpha's chair, but his jaw was tight, his patience fraying. "The southern border needs more patrols," Margaret snapped, her sharp features a match to her sharper tone. "We've seen their tracks. New rogue bands moving through the valley. It's only a matter of time before they push further. And pull guards from where exactly?" Elder Corwin retorted, his voice a grumbling bass that made the room feel even smaller. "You think the northern pass will hold itself? We're stretched too thin as it is. If the rogues take root," Margaret shot back, "we'll lose control of the valley completely. Letting them settle is far riskier than loosening northern defenses." "Then loosen the lowland patrols," Corwin countered, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "The valley might be our main trade route, but if we leave the mountains unguarded, they'll have our throats before we even hear them coming." Margraith bared her teeth in what barely qualified as a smile. "Leave it to you to ignore the bigger picture, Corwin." "Enough." Kaden's voice cut through the air, firm and cold. The elders fell silent, their gazes snapping to him. He rarely raised his voice, partly because his father had never needed to, and partly because he preferred to save such moments for when they mattered most. "We can't solve this by fighting amongst ourselves," he said, keeping his tone steady, even. "Margaret, Corwin, both of you have valid points, but shifting patrols isn't a solution. It's a temporary patch." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. It wasn't often that he didn't take someone's side outright, but Kaden wasn't in the business of choosing factions. Not when the pack couldn't afford to fracture any further. He didn't need to be an alpha to see the cracks forming, the alliances fraying. Every argument like this pushed them closer to collapse. "We'll convene again at sunrise," he continued. "Until then, I expect each of you to consider the broader strategy, not just your own corner of the forest." There was a moment's pause before Margaret gave a curt nod, her lips pressed thin. Corwin grunted something that might have been agreement. The other elders murmured among themselves, their tension ebbing only slightly. As they began to file out, Kaden rose, pushing back the heavy chair and stepping away from the table that felt more like a battlefield than a council's meeting place. It wasn't until most of the elders had left that a hand settled on his shoulder, light but firm. Kaden turned to see Ranulph, his father's oldest advisor. The elder wolf's gray hair hung loose past his shoulders, his expression calm and steady in a way that only years of experience could manage. The pack had nicknamed him Ironroot for a reason. He never wavered, never yielded to panic. "Walk with me, boy," Ranulph said, his voice low but not unkind. Kaden hesitated, then nodded, letting the elder guide him out of the stuffy chamber and into the cool, damp air of the pack's stronghold. The walls of the longhouse gave way to the open courtyard, where torches flickered in the breeze. The scent of pine and moss was sharper here, a welcome contrast to the council's oppressive space. They walked in silence for a few paces, the gravel crunching beneath their boots. Then Ranulph spoke, his tone more solemn than usual. "You're keeping them together, for now. But you know, that won't last." "I know," Kaden said quietly. His shoulders felt heavier with each step. "They're restless, scared. No one says it outright, but it's obvious. The more pressure we're under, the more they'll turn on each other." Ranulph glanced at him, his weathered face unreadable. "And you? What are you afraid of?" Kaden frowned. "What do you mean?" "You hesitate," Ranulph said. "Not out of weakness. No one would dare call you that. But I've seen you holding back. The alpha blood in you is strong, yet you don't use it. Why?" Kaden didn't answer right away. How could he explain the unease that gnawed at him? The feeling that his strength wasn't entirely his own. That unlocking whatever power lay dormant inside him might cost more than he was willing to pay. Ranulph slowed his steps, stopping near the edge of the courtyard. "I've served this pack for longer than you've been alive, boy. I knew your father when he was no older than you are now, and I know that what runs through your veins is unlike anything we've ever seen." Kaden looked away, his gaze falling to the torchlight reflected in the damp cobblestones. "I'm not my father." "No," Ranulph said softly, "and that might be what saves us all, but you have to accept what you are before this pack tears itself apart." Ranulph turned to face him fully, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "The prophecy didn't come to pass so you could hesitate. You were chosen because you're meant to lead them, not just keep them from breaking. Whatever power you are afraid of, it's time to embrace it." Kaden felt the weight of those words settle into his chest. Ranulph gave his shoulder a firm squeeze before stepping back, leaving him alone beneath the dark sky. The torches flickered, the wind rustled through the trees, and for a long moment, Kaden just stood there, staring into the night. A heart will awaken, but at what cost? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. Chapter 2. A Rival's Resentment. The torches in the chamber burned low, their flames casting long, flickering shadows against the cold stone walls. The air here was damp, thick with the scent of damp earth and aged wood. It suited him. Darkness suited him. Isaac sat at the heavy oak table, fingers tracing the rim of a silver goblet, though he hadn't touched the wine within. It wasn't the drink he was savoring. It was the weight of what was about to unfold. Across from him, the figure in the hooded cloak leaned forward, gloved hands folded. Their voice was smooth, almost amused. "You look troubled." Isaac let out a sharp, humorless breath. "Do I?" "You tell me." A pause. "Or should I say, does it trouble you that he sits in the Alpha's chair while you remain in the shadows?" Isaac's jaw tightened. The cloak concealed the stranger's features, but he felt the scrutiny like a blade against his skin. He had been careful, so careful, not to let his resentment slip in public. But here, in the belly of the mountain stronghold, he had no need for masks. His fingers curled into a fist against the table. Kaden isn't fit to lead. He hesitates, he doubts, he clings to a pack that barely listens to him. He lifted his gaze to the hooded figure. The others see it, even if they won't say it aloud. "And yet," the figure mused, "they still follow him." A muscle in Isaac's jaw twitched. For now. It had always been that way, hadn't it? Kaden, the golden son, the rightful heir. Kaden who carried his father's legacy like a crown he neither wanted nor deserved. Kaden who had been given everything, while Isaac had been forced to carve his place from the shadows. And the prophecy, that damned prophecy, only cemented it further. The moon's chosen. The Alpha who would awaken. It was as if the fates themselves were determined to hand him power on a silver platter. Isaac exhaled slowly, pressing his hands flat against the table to steady himself. If Kaden falls, the pack will need someone to step in. Someone strong. Someone decisive. The hooded figure tilted their head. "And that someone is you." Isaac didn't bother denying it. "They won't accept me outright, not yet. But if Kaden stumbles, when he stumbles, I'll be ready." The figure chuckled softly, a sound like silk sliding over steel. "Spoken like a true strategist. But tell me, Isaac," a pause, "are you willing to do what must be done?" Coiling like smoke in his lungs. It was a simple question, and yet it felt weighted, as though the answer would change more than he could yet see. Isaac met their gaze, or at least where he assumed their eyes were beneath the hood. "I won't kill him." The hooded figure leaned back, considering. "You won't have to." A beat of silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken possibilities. Then the figure reached into the folds of their cloak and slid a small, gleaming vial across the table. The liquid inside shimmered, dark, nearly black, with streaks of something luminous curling through it. Isaac picked it up, watching the substance shift like ink in water. "This will ensure his power remains dormant." The figure's voice was smooth, patient. We can't erase what's in his blood, but we can delay it. Keep him uncertain. Keep him weak. Isaac rolled the vial between his fingers, considering. Weak. Hesitant. And if Kaden was weak, the pack would have no choice but to turn to someone stronger, someone willing to do what needed to be done. A slow smile curved his lips. For once, fate wouldn't decide, he would. Isaac leaned against the cold stone wall, his fingers idly tracing the etched surface. The hooded figure stood across from him. Shrouded in flickering torchlight, the flames painted fleeting shadows on the floor, their movements erratic, like the scheme swirling in Isaac's mind. I have no intention of waiting around for fate to unfold, Isaac said, his voice low but tight with disdain. Kaden's still fumbling his way through council meetings, still clinging to the idea that if he tries hard enough, the pack will follow him. But we both know how this ends. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they reached into their cloak, pulling out a small leather satchel. It's one thing to believe he'll falter, the figure said, placing the satchel on the table between them. It's another to ensure it. Isaac didn't look at the satchel, not yet. His gaze remained fixed on the figure. I'm listening. You're aware of the prophecy, the figure continued, voice smooth as a blade drawn from a sheath. The Alpha who awakens. The heart that will lead the pack into a new era. It's no secret who they believe it is. Kaden's lineage guarantees they'll back him. Until he fails them. But there's more than one way to interpret such a prophecy. Isaac straightened, his arms crossing over his chest. Are you saying it's open to interpretation? The figure tilted their head slightly. I'm saying that what the pack expects isn't necessarily the truth. Perhaps the prophecy refers not to him, but to the one who steps in after him. Perhaps the awakening isn't what they think it is. Isaac felt a cold ripple run down his spine. The pack elders had always spoken of the prophecy in hushed, reverent tones, as if it were scripture. But if it wasn't as straightforward as they believed, if there was room for a different kind of fulfillment. It's an interesting theory, he said carefully. What makes you so certain Kaden isn't the chosen alpha? The figure reached out and tapped the satchel once. Because power isn't inherited, it's claimed. And I suspect you've always known that. Now Isaac's gaze dropped to the satchel. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward and unlatched it. Inside was a piece of something dark, metallic. Not quite a weapon, not quite jewelry. A medallion? A shard of armor? It glinted faintly under the torchlight, its edges lined with intricate ancient runes. He picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his palm. It was cold, unnaturally so, and as he held it, he swore he heard a faint hum, as if it were alive. What is this? He asked, keeping his voice even. A tool, the figure replied. One that ensures you can tilt the scales when the time comes. With it, you won't have to rely on others' weakness to rise. You'll have a claim of your own, a claim that will silence the doubters. Isaac stared at the artifact, the hum growing stronger. It wasn't just cold, it was pulsating, resonating with something deep inside him. It felt like a key, though to what door he couldn't say. If I take this, Isaac said, there's no going back. The figure smiled faintly. There never was. Isaac closed his fingers around the object. The faint hum pulsed through his skin, sending a shiver up his arm. He turned it over once more before tucking it into his coat. The weight of it settled against his chest like a promise. Or a curse. Then we have a deal, Isaac said, his voice steady now. The hooded figure stepped back into the shadows, their face disappearing entirely. I'll be in touch. Isaac didn't wait for them to leave. He turned on his heel and headed for the chamber's narrow exit. His boots echoed against the stone floor, the cold air stinging his skin. He didn't look back. Outside, the moon hung high above the treetops, its light turning the forest to silver and shadow. Isaac stepped into the clearing, the artifact's chill pressing against his heart. The prophecy had been a distant story, a tale that always pointed to Kaden. But now, for the first time, Isaac felt the stirrings of something else. A future that belonged to him. The heavy door of his quarters thudded shut, echoing through the quiet stone walls. Kaden exhaled slowly, stripping the leather gauntlets from his hands. They hit the table with a dull, satisfying weight. It should have felt like shedding a burden. Instead, the silence pressed harder against him. His quarters were larger than most, but the air inside always seemed close. The rich wood paneling, the heavy brocade drapes, and the intricately carved furniture of what others might see as signs of authority only reminded him of the man who had once occupied this space, a room shaped by his father's legacy, and now, unwillingly, by his. Kaden ran a hand through his hair, strands sticking up in unruly directions. His father had never allowed that kind of mess. Everything about him had been precision, control. His father could summon obedience with a single glance, could make even the most defiant wolf fall in line without uttering a word. And it wasn't just fear, though there had been plenty of that. It was the unshakable belief that his father was right, that he was untouchable. There were times, in the moments just before sleep, that Kaden wished for that certainty. Not the iron will or the sharp tongue, just the knowledge that he was, without question, the right one to lead. He'd thought he'd have years before it came to this, years to prepare. But now, every meeting, every council session, every argument, left him feeling like he was running on uneven ground. No matter how he tried to steady himself, the cracks in the pack's trust only widened. He leaned on the windowsill, staring out at the forest beyond. The night was quiet. Too quiet. A cool breeze slipped through the gap in the panes, tugging at the papers scattered across his desk. Among them were letters from the elders, a half-finished patrol schedule, and the pack's financial records. One document, however, stood out, an old parchment with a seal broken long ago. The prophecy. Kaden didn't need to read it again. He knew every word. The Alpha whose heart would awaken, who would guide the pack into a new age, the one who would rise above all, destined to lead and protect. His father had claimed it referred to him. The elders had echoed it. And Kaden, once, long ago, had dared to believe it might be true. But now the words felt heavy, hollow. He didn't feel awakened. He felt cornered, like a wolf caught in a snare, forced to choose between gnawing his leg off or waiting for the hunter to arrive. He closed his eyes, willing the doubt to pass, but the doubts didn't care for his wishes. They lingered, insistent whispers at the edges of his mind. What if the prophecy wasn't about him? What if it had never been? What if the one who was meant to lead was still out there, someone stronger, more certain, more worthy? A knock at the door startled him. He straightened, fists clenching at his sides. "That is it?" There was a pause before the door creaked open. A young messenger slipped in, head bowed. "Alpha, Kaden," he stammered. "The council's requested an update. They're wondering about the northern patrols." Kaden forced himself to breathe, to keep his voice steady. "Tell them I'll address it tomorrow." "Yes, sir." The boy's eyes darted nervously around the room before he ducked back out. When the door clicked shut again, the weight in the air seemed heavier. Kaden sank into the chair by the fire, the flickering flames casting sharp shadows across the room. For all the power his position gave him, for all the respect he was supposed to command, he still felt like a figure carved out of stone, hard on the outside, hollow within. The prophecy was supposed to mean something. His father had made him believe it was his destiny. Now he couldn't shake the feeling that it might only be a story. And if it was just a story, then what was he? Nothing more than a placeholder, a pretender wearing a crown too big for his head. Kaden rested his head in his hands. Somewhere, beyond these walls, his pack waited for his direction. Somewhere, the rogues plotted. Somewhere, The forest held answers he couldn't reach, and somewhere, he knew it as surely as he knew his own name, a pair of golden eyes waited in the shadows, watching, waiting for the moment he'd meet them and everything would change. But for now he sat in the flickering light, alone with his doubts. Kaden's quarters were too quiet, the kind of quiet that allowed thoughts to fester. He stood by the hearth, one hand braced against the mantel, the other gripping a cup of water that had long since gone cold. The embers cast a dim orange glow, shadows curling against the walls like restless spirits. The weight of the council's meeting lingered in the room, a ghost of tension that clung to the heavy wood beams and thick stone walls. Every decision, every conversation felt like a trial, a test of his ability to fill the space his father had left behind. And he was failing. The prophecy surfaced in his mind, unbidden. Lines he hadn't read in years whispered through his thoughts, accompanied by the faces of the elders, their looks expectant, almost hungry. The Alpha whose heart will awaken. The words drifted through him like smoke. A protector to their kind, forged by moonlight's hand, destined to lead. Kaden squeezed his eyes shut, as if he could force the words out of his head. He remembered the way his father had spoken about it, not as an open question but as a certainty. "This is who you are, boy," his father had said. "It's in your blood, your birthright." Yet, as he stood here now, staring into the half-dead embers of the fire, he couldn't feel it. Not the strength, not the certainty, not the awakening they all spoke of. He only felt the weight. Heavy and suffocating, like the ceiling might come down at any moment. His reflection in the window caught his eye, distorted by the rippled glass. He looked tired, too young for the responsibility on his shoulders, too old to keep pretending he wasn't carrying it. A growl rumbled low in his throat before he even realized it. He set the cup down sharply on the mantel, the ceramic clinking against the stone. His chest tightened, that primal edge creeping through his body, the one he tried so hard to keep buried. The wolf within stirred. It was faint now, just a whisper of movement, but it was enough to remind him that something deeper, darker waited inside, something he hadn't learned to trust. His fingers flexed, nails lengthening into something sharper before he clenched his fists, forcing them back. The change always came so easily, too easily, like an instinct he couldn't unlearn. And every time it did, it made the doubt worse, made the question louder. What if this is all you are? Another growl, rougher this time, echoed in his chest. The room seemed smaller, more stifling, the fire too dim, the shadows too deep. He turned away from the hearth and paced to the window, pulling it open. The night air was sharp and cold, the scent of pine and damp earth rushing in like a flood. Kaden took a deep breath, then another. The wolf receded, leaving only a faint ache in his bones, and that gnawing uncertainty in his chest. He looked out at the forest, its dark canopy swaying under a silver-tinged sky. Somewhere out there, his pack waited for him to lead. Somewhere out there, the prophecy waited to be fulfilled. But tonight, all he could do was stand here, gripping the edge of the window and wondering if the moon had made a mistake. Chapter 3. The Destined Mate Arrives. Twilight softened the sharp edges of the trees, turning the dense forest into a wash of cool blues and silvers. The pack's patrol route wound through a stretch of woods that Kaden knew as well as the lines on his palm. Twisting paths that carried the scent of pine resin and damp earth, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig beneath his boots. This time, though, something was different. The forest, normally a symphony of rustling leaves and distant bird calls, felt still, waiting. Even his wolf, ever present in the back of his mind, was quieter than usual, as if straining to listen for something Kaden hadn't yet noticed. It happened near the old oak that marked the western edge of their territory. He caught her scent first, an unfamiliar blend of fresh rain and something darker, richer, not rogue, not pack, foreign, but not threatening. And then he saw her. She emerged from the shadows like she belonged to them, her steps measured, deliberate, a traveler's cloak, worn, slightly dusty, draped over her shoulders, but it couldn't conceal the lithe strength in her posture. Her hood was pushed back, just enough to reveal the curve of her jaw, the dark waves of hair tumbling down her back. She carried a small satchel slung across her chest, and her fingers rested lightly on its strap, as though she was ready to draw something out in an instant. She didn't look lost. She looked like someone who knew exactly where she was, even if she had no reason to be there. Kaden's hand hovered over the hilt of the blade at his side, but he didn't draw it. Something about her calm, her stillness, made him pause. As if sensing his presence, she stopped at the base of the oak, her head tilted slightly, and then her gaze found him. It wasn't the typical, guarded wariness of a lone traveler crossing unfamiliar ground. No, her eyes, golden and vivid even in the dim light, locked onto his as if she had been searching for him all along. He couldn't look away. It wasn't just her striking features, or the way she stood so still and unafraid. It was the pull, a subtle, insistent tug in his chest, as if the air between them carried a thread that had always been there, waiting for this moment to draw tight. Kaden straightened, his fingers easing away from the blade. He stepped out from behind the tree, his boots crunching softly against the forest floor. "You're far from the main roads," he said, his voice steady despite the faint unease blooming in his chest. Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but enough to make the world feel even quieter. "So, are you?" He took another step closer, the pull between them growing stronger, more insistent. "This is pack territory. Most travelers steer clear." Her head tilted again, golden eyes studying him like she was turning over a riddle in her mind. "I've heard stories of this place. Of the forest that never sleeps, and the wolves who guard it." His wolf stirred. Not with suspicion, but with a strange sense of recognition. It didn't make sense. She was no one he knew, no one he'd ever seen before. Kaden kept his stance neutral, though his pulse was unsteady. "And yet you decided to walk right in." She shrugged, one corner of her mouth lifting in what might have been amusement. "Maybe I was curious." "Curiosity can be dangerous," he said, the faintest edge creeping into his tone. Her gaze dropped to the ground for a moment, then lifted back to his. The faint flicker of amusement was gone now, replaced by something quieter. "Sometimes, danger is worth it." The words settled between them, heavier than they should have been. He couldn't decide if she was challenging him or if she was trying to say something else entirely. Either way, his wolf rumbled faintly in response, a low sound that made his chest tighten. They stood like that for a moment longer, the quiet forest seeming to hold its breath. He should have asked her more. Her name, her reason for being here. He should have demanded answers, but he didn't. Something about her made it impossible to ask. Instead, he found himself taking another step forward, close enough now to see the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the smudge of dirt on her cheek. She'd been traveling for a while. "You should move on," he said finally, though the words didn't feel right in his mouth. "It's not safe here." Her gaze lingered on his for just a beat longer before she nodded, the faintest movement of her head. "I'll consider it." She turned and walked off the trail, disappearing into the trees without a sound. Kaden stayed where he was, the tension in his chest coiling tighter with every second she moved farther away. When he finally started walking again, he couldn't shake the pull, as if that invisible thread still connected them, no matter how far she went. Kaden watched her disappear into the shadows of the forest, the faint whisper of her steps swallowed by the undergrowth. His eyes lingered on the spot where she'd stood, his mind circling back to the brief, quiet pull he'd felt, so subtle it could have been imagined, and yet strong enough to leave a mark. She had seemed familiar in a way that made his chest tighten and his wolf stir. Not a memory he could grab hold of, but something older, deeper, like hearing a melody you'd never learned but somehow knew by heart. And those eyes. He'd seen golden eyes before, rogues, strangers, enemies, but hers weren't like those. They hadn't been cold, hostile, or challenging. They'd been steady, sharp, unyielding but not unkind, the kind of gaze that spoke of a mind that noticed everything and missed nothing. Kaden turned back to the trail, his boots crunching against the dirt as he resumed his patrol. His pulse hadn't quite settled. The interaction had been too brief, too strange. If she was a traveler, why had she ventured so deep into pack territory alone? If she was lost, why had she seemed so calm? And if she wasn't lost, what was she looking for? The wolf in him growled low, a sound that rumbled through his chest, urging him to turn back, to follow her, to see if she was still there. But he kept moving, forcing his mind to focus on the patrol ahead, the stretches of forest that still needed to be checked before the moon rose higher. Still, the questions lingered, tugging at the edges of his thoughts. He'd never seen her before, he was sure of that, and yet, she'd felt like someone he should know. The ceremony was held in the heart of the forest, where the trees parted to reveal a natural clearing that seemed touched by an otherworldly glow. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in fragmented beams, casting intricate patterns over the mossy ground. The pack stood in a wide circle, their faces illuminated by the soft golden light of lanterns hung from ancient oaks. It should have been a moment of unity. The elders murmured their blessings in the old language, their hands raised toward the sky. Around them, the younger wolves watched with quiet reverence, their gazes flickering between the elder council and the figure standing at the center of the clearing. Kaden. He was meant to be a symbol of strength and control, the future alpha who would lead them into a new age, who would honor his father's legacy while forging his own path. He was meant to be steady, certain. Yet, as the ceremony progressed, Kaden felt his hands clench at his sides, his pulse quickening with every word spoken by the council. The prophecy hung over him like a storm cloud, the elders' chants and prayers only adding weight to the expectations already crushing his shoulders. He tried to focus on the ceremony, to steady his breathing, but it was no use. The words of the prophecy echoed in his mind. The alpha whose heart will awaken, the wolf within him stirred, not the quiet, steady presence he was used to, but something sharper, more insistent. Kaden closed his eyes, willing the sensation to pass. But it didn't. It built instead, heat curling low in his chest, spreading outward. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the chants, the murmurs, even the rustle of the forest. He felt the shift before it fully took hold, the tightening of his muscles, the prickling heat beneath his skin. The wolf clawed at the surface, demanding to be let out, demanding to take control.
No,
Kaden whispered, barely audible over the hum of voices. He gritted his teeth, digging his nails into his palms. Not now, not here. But the wolf didn't listen. It surged forward, and a low growl escaped his throat. The sound silenced the clearing. The chant stopped. All eyes turned to him. Kaden staggered a step back, his breathing ragged. He felt the change begin, his vision sharpening, his senses heightening, the fine edges of his control slipping away like sand through his fingers. The elders exchanged glances. Some of the younger wolves stepped back, their gazes wide with uncertainty. Only a few looked on with something close to awe. He couldn't let it happen, not in front of everyone. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to focus on the sounds of the forest, the wind in the branches, the faint chirp of crickets. Anything to ground him, to anchor him. The wolf's growl deepened, and Kaden fell to one knee, his chest heaving. The heat pulsed through him again, stronger this time, as if the very air around him had thickened. The world narrowed to the rhythm of his racing heart, the fire in his veins. A voice cut through the haze, an elder's, sharp and commanding. "Control it, now!" Kaden opened his eyes. The wolf's fury glinted in their depths, a primal force that wanted to consume, to dominate. But he wasn't the boy who'd lost control years ago. He wasn't the half-grown wolf who couldn't rein in his instincts. He forced a slow breath, then another. His hands steadied. The wolf inside him howled once, defiant, but it didn't overtake him. The clearing remained silent, the air thick with tension. Kaden rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate. The heat subsided, though it still simmered just beneath the surface, a reminder of how close he'd come. The ceremony resumed, though the mood had shifted. The elders' words were less certain now, their blessings tinged with unease. The younger wolves watched Kaden as if they didn't know who or what he was. Kaden stood still, his face calm, but inside he replayed those moments over and over. He'd come so close to losing control, to proving the doubters right. He'd felt the wolf's power, raw and untamed. It wasn't the last time he'd face it. And the next time, he wasn't sure he could hold it back. The murmurs began softly, like the stirring of leaves before a storm. The elders, who had spent decades mastering their composure, couldn't quite hide the unease, sharpening their whispers. Kaden felt their tension like a current humming beneath the surface, even as he fought to steady the wild thrum of his own pulse. He caught the flicker of movement in his periphery, an elder leaning in to murmur in another's ear. He didn't have to strain to hear it. "It's too soon," the elder said, his voice tight. "He's not ready to control it." Another elder shot him a glance, her brows furrowing in thought. "If he can't," she began, but left the rest unsaid. No one finished that sentence aloud. They didn't have to. Kaden clenched his jaw. The wolf inside him snarled at the sound of their doubt. Not now. He couldn't lose control now. Not when the pack watched. Not when he was supposed to prove he could lead. The younger wolves were less subtle. They stood a few paces back from the circle of elders, some barely more than teens, still learning to rein in their instincts. He could see their awe as plain as the moonlight, wide eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of power that danced around him like heat on a summer road. To them, it wasn't failure. It was strength, something to aspire to, something that reminded them why the Alpha was more than just a title. One of them, a tall boy with hair too long for pack tradition, whispered loud enough for Kaden to catch. "Did you see that? He barely moved, and it answered, like it knows him." Another, a girl who couldn't have been more than 17, nodded. "It's real, the prophecy. What they said about his blood? It's real." Their words should have bolstered him. Instead, they sat heavy on his shoulders. As much as they admired him now, he knew how quickly awe could sour into fear if he let that wildness slip too far. He couldn't be a beast, not in front of them. Then his gaze caught something unexpected. Amid the gathered wolves, just beyond the youngest pack members, stood a figure he hadn't noticed before. She was still wrapped in that travel-worn cloak, its edges dusted with the forest's soil, but her hood was down now, and her eyes? Those golden eyes were fixed squarely on him. Her expression was unreadable, calm in a way that didn't belong in a place as charged as this clearing. She didn't flinch at the raw power radiating from him, didn't shrink away like some of the others. She only watched, a faint crease at the corner of her mouth, as though she saw not just the power but what lay beneath it, as though she understood what it meant. Kaden forced himself to look away first, breaking the connection with a tightening in his chest. If the elders had noticed her, they gave no sign. But her presence lingered, a quiet reminder that he wasn't the only one who understood the weight of what had just happened. He straightened his back, exhaled slowly, and stepped out of the center of the circle. The murmurs quieted, the younger wolves leaned forward, waiting for his next move. The elders, too, turned their eyes to him, their doubt now mingling with a tentative, wary respect. The ceremony wasn't over yet, but Kaden already knew. Something had changed. Chapter 4. Alliances and Subterfuge. The moonlight didn't reach the cramped chamber beneath the pack's western outpost, but Isaac didn't need light. He preferred the shadows. Preferred the way they cloaked the faces of those who had come to listen, to conspire. The air down here smelled faintly of earth and damp wood, but the dozen wolves huddled around the heavy oak table weren't here for comfort. They were here because Isaac had called them. He leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, letting them murmur and shift in their seats. Their unease was a weapon he knew how to wield. Uncertainty could be twisted into ambition. Suspicion could become loyalty, if handled correctly. "Tell me," he said at last, his voice low, casual. The murmurs ceased. "How much longer are you willing to wait?" No one answered immediately. He had expected that. They weren't leaders, they were followers by nature. That made them predictable. It also made them malleable. Isaac pushed off the wall, pacing slowly around the room. The floor creaked faintly under his boots. Kaden sits in the Alpha's chair, but what has he done to prove he deserves it? He let the question hang in the air. He talks about patrols and strategies. He quotes the elders, pretends to care about tradition. But what has he done? One of the younger wolves shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting toward the table. Isaac stopped behind him, resting a hand on the back of the chair. "Go ahead," Isaac said, his tone smooth. "Speak your mind." The younger wolf swallowed, his voice uncertain. "Kaden, he's trying. He's just new." Isaac's lips curved into a cold smile. "New." He let out a soft chuckle. "Do you think the rogues care that he's new? Do you think they'll wait until he finds his footing before they tear through the northern pass? Or that the elders will suddenly stop doubting him once they realize he's in over his head?" Another wolf, older and broader, frowned. "What do you want us to do, Isaac? Defy the council? Take the pack by force?" Isaac circled the table, his gaze sweeping over the group. "I'm not asking for rebellion. I'm offering a choice." He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "Stand with me, and I'll make sure you're protected, that your voices are heard, that your families have what they need when the pack begins to splinter." The older wolf narrowed his eyes. "And what do you get in return?" Isaac's smile didn't waver. "Loyalty. That's all I'm asking for. When the time comes, when Kaden fails and the pack looks for someone strong enough to lead, stand with me. Nothing more, nothing less." The room was quiet again, the weight of his words settling over them. Isaac straightened, crossing his arms. He didn't need their immediate agreement. The seeds were planted. The doubt would grow. One of the younger wolves' lean and sharp muscular body spoke up, his voice low but certain. "What makes you so sure Kaden will fail?" Isaac's gaze flicked to him, and for a moment he let the silence stretch. Then he reached into the satchel at his side, pulling out a small, gleaming object. He placed it on the table, an ancient medallion, its surface etched with runes that glinted faintly even in the dim light. "Because I'm not waiting for him to fail," Isaac said, his voice cold and sure. "I'm ensuring it." The whispers had already begun to slither through the pack like a slow-moving poison. Isaac didn't need to fan the flames. He had only needed to strike the match. The embers of doubt had been there for weeks, lying dormant beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to ignite. He strolled through the central hall of the pack's stronghold, nodding in acknowledgement at those who passed, listening to the hushed conversations that died the moment they realized he was close enough to hear. The art of rumor spreading wasn't about shouting from the rooftops. It was about knowing when to speak, and more importantly, when to let silence do the work for him. "You heard about what happened during the ceremony?" A voice drifted from the corridor near the training grounds. Isaac slowed his steps, just enough to hear. "Lost control," the speaker continued, voice laced with unease. "I saw it myself. The way his eyes went blank, the way his body seized. It wasn't just the shift, it was something wrong." Isaac turned the corner before they could see him eavesdropping. His expression was carefully neutral, The perfect balance of polite concern and quiet authority. The two wolves speaking, middle ranks enforcers loyal to no one in particular, looked startled to see him. "I couldn't help but overhear," Isaac said smoothly. "You were speaking about the Alpha?" He didn't need to specify which one. Kaden was the only name on everyone's lips these days. The two wolves exchanged glances. The bolder of the two, a wiry man with a scar across his jaw, straightened. "It was just something we noticed, Beta," he said cautiously. Isaac offered them a small, understanding smile. "You don't need to be so careful with your words. If you saw something concerning, it's your duty to speak on it." He folded his arms. Was it true? Did he lose control? The man hesitated, then gave a slow nod. It was strange. The shift shouldn't have been that hard for him. I mean, he's the Alpha. If he can't handle it... He let the sentence dangle in the air, unfinished but heavy with implication. Isaac sighed, running a hand over his jaw as if weighing the information. "I don't doubt his strength," he said, his voice low, "but I worry. Taking the Alpha's seat so young, with the weight of the prophecy hanging over him? It's a burden no wolf should have to carry alone, and pressure does strange things to the mind." The wolves leaned in slightly, drawn in by the intimacy of his words. "Wouldn't," the other enforcer, younger and hesitant, shifted on his feet. "He wouldn't hurt anyone though, right?" Isaac hesitated just long enough, then, "Of course not," a carefully timed pause. "But tell me, did he seem aware of what he was doing?" The first enforcer shook his head. "No, it was like something else was taking over." Isaac let out a breath, feigning reluctance. "That's what I feared." And just like that, the rumor took a new shape. Not of an Alpha simply struggling, but of something darker. A leader who might not be fully in control of himself. Isaac clasped the younger wolf's shoulder, his grip firm. "Keep this between us for now. The pack needs stability, not panic, but if you see anything else, anything that concerns you, come to me." Both men nodded. He left them standing in the corridor, exchanging uneasy glances. The fear was settling in nicely. Later that night, the hidden agenda. The hidden chamber beneath the stronghold was candlelit, the flames casting flickering shadows against the damp stone walls. Isaac stood near the long wooden table, fingers trailing over the surface as he listened to the figure across from him. "You've done well," the cloaked figure murmured. Their voice was low, genderless, almost inhuman in its neutrality. Doubt festers quickly when planted in the right places. Isaac didn't bother with false humility. "It wasn't difficult. Kaden's doing most of the work for me." The figure chuckled softly, though there was no warmth in it. "The prophecy may favor him, but the pack? The pack will turn on him the moment they sense weakness, and when they do, I'll be ready," Isaac finished. He had no intention of being anyone's puppet, but for now, he would play the game. The figure tilted their head slightly. "And when the time comes, you will fulfill your part of the deal?" Isaac's fingers curled against the wood, his expression momentarily unreadable. "Yes." The figure studied him for a moment longer, then reached into the folds of their cloak, pulling out a small velvet pouch. They placed it on the table between them and slid it forward. Isaac picked it up, feeling the weight inside, heavy for its size. He loosened the drawstring and let the contents spill into his palm. A ring, black as obsidian, its surface etched with runes that shimmered faintly in the candlelight, a symbol of something ancient, a promise of power, of something far greater than just the Alpha's seat. He exhaled slowly, closing his fingers around it. The figure's voice was little more than a whisper now. "The real battle hasn't begun yet, but it will," Isaac smirked, sliding the ring into his pocket. "Good. I like a challenge." The figure chuckled again, stepping back into the darkness. Isaac remained where he was, listening to the silence. Kaden might still be the Alpha, for now, but soon, the pack would realize the truth. And when they did, Isaac would be standing exactly where he was meant to be. The lake was hidden deep within the forest, a still, glassy expanse tucked between towering pines. The moon hovered low, casting its silver reflection across the water, like a trail leading into the unknown. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, of something fresh and untouched, as though the place had been waiting for them. Kaden hadn't meant to find her, not here, not now. He'd left the stronghold to clear his head, to put distance between himself and the suffocating whispers of the pack. Whispers of doubt, of questions he didn't have answers to. But as soon as he stepped into the clearing, the scent hit him. That same impossible mix of rain and something darker, something richer. Something undeniably her. She stood at the lake's edge, her cloak pushed back from her shoulders, her dark hair cascading in loose waves. Moonlight caught the golden sheen in her eyes as she gazed at the water, unmoving, as if she had been here forever, as if she belonged here. Pudden's pulse kicked up, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because she was the first person in weeks he hadn't had to measure his words around. Maybe it was because she'd already looked into the rawest parts of him, had seen his power flare, had watched him barely hold it back. And yet, she had not run. Or maybe it was because, even now, when she should have been nothing more than a passing traveler, he couldn't stop feeling as if she was something more. "Do you always stalk your packmates like this?" Her voice cut through the quiet, dry and amused, but her gaze remained on the water. Kaden leaned against a nearby tree, crossing his arms. "You're not my packmate." That made her look at him, a slow turn of her head, those golden eyes gleaming like a predator sizing up her prey. "No," she agreed, "I'm not." His wolf stirred, not in warning, but in something else. Something curious. She turned back to the water. "But you've been thinking about me." Kaden let out a sharp exhale. "That arrogant or just observant?" "Both." A small smirk played at the corner of her lips. Gods, she was dangerous. Not in the way a blade was dangerous. Obvious, brutal. No, she was the kind of danger you only realized too late, when the trap had already closed around your throat. A silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The usual weight that pressed on his chest when he was around others, the expectation, the scrutiny, didn't feel as heavy here. With her, he studied her profile, the sharp angle of her jaw, the way the moonlight softened the edges of her face. He didn't even know her name. "I don't know why you're here," he admitted finally. Her fingers brushed over the surface of the water, breaking the reflection into shimmering fragments. "And if I told you I don't either?" He considered her words. "I wouldn't believe you." That won him another glance, this one more assessing, as if he'd surprised her. Her voice was quieter when she spoke again. "I've always been drawn to places like this." A small pause. "Places where the world feels..." Paused. "Like nothing exists beyond this moment." Kaden understood that more than he cared to admit. He rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. "You're avoiding something." A short laugh, bitter and knowing. "Aren't we all?" He didn't argue. The silence stretched again, but this time it was heavier. Not with discomfort, but with something unspoken, something that hung in the space between them, just waiting for one of them to name it. Kaden wasn't sure he wanted to. Instead he asked, "Why were you at the ceremony?" "I was curious." He gave her a pointed look. She sighed, tilting her head back to look at the sky. "Because I wanted to see if the stories were true." His brows furrowed. "What stories?" She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. That the Alpha's bloodline was different, that his power was unlike anything seen before. His stomach tightened. "And what did you see?" Her gaze met his, then steady, unwavering. "That you're afraid of it." Kaden went still, not because she was wrong, but because she was right, and no one had ever dared to say it to his face. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, a slow heat rising in his chest, not from anger, but from the way her words stripped him bare, peeled back the layers he'd so carefully built. She turned fully toward him, stepping closer. "Power like that isn't meant to be contained forever," she murmured. "One day it will demand to be let out." He swallowed hard, his wolf pressing against the inside of his ribs, restless. "And when that day comes," he asked, his voice lower now, rougher. She reached out then, barely a breath between them, and pressed a single fingertip to the center of his chest, right where his heart beat, wild and unsteady. "Then you'll have to decide what kind of monster you want to be." Kaden exhaled slowly. He didn't step back, didn't move at all, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. Kaden should have stepped away, should have ignored the strange pull tightening in his chest the moment her fingertip pressed against him, a touch so light it shouldn't have affected him at all. And yet, his heartbeat tripped beneath her hand, as if answering a question neither of them had spoken aloud. She didn't move. Neither did he. The silence between them thickened, heavy with something unnamed. The lake was still behind her, its silver surface reflecting the moon, the shifting branches of the trees. But all Kaden could focus on was her. The sharp line of her jaw, the way her golden eyes burned with something she wasn't saying. He didn't even know her name. And yet, the wolf inside him, restless, impatient, pressed closer, prowling just beneath his skin. Not with aggression, not with the need for dominance or power, but something else. Something quieter, more dangerous. His body was tense, his pulse too fast. But she only watched him, waiting, not yielding. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to say something, but she hesitated, and that hesitation, that fraction of a second where uncertainty flickered across her face, made the air between them hum. Kaden's breath was shallow. His instincts, the ones that had been drilled into him since childhood, the ones that warned him to be careful, to never let his emotions dictate his actions, were suddenly fraying at the edges. He had never felt anything like this before. The urge to close the distance, to see if the warmth of her hand was the same everywhere else, to tilt her chin up just a fraction more, and his jaw clenched. He tore his gaze away, stepping back as if distance could sever whatever this was. It didn't. Her hand dropped to her side, slow, deliberate. He felt the loss of her touch more than he should have. Kaden exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face as if that would clear his head. It didn't. She was watching him carefully now, her expression unreadable, but beneath it, he saw the same thing he felt. An awareness neither of them had been prepared for. He shook his head, forcing himself to break the silence. "I don't even know your name." A hint of amusement flickered in her golden eyes. "That bothers you? It shouldn't." He knew that. And yet, yes, he admitted, his voice rough. She studied him for a moment. Then, finally, she spoke. "Seline." It shouldn't have meant anything, shouldn't have settled into his bones the way it did. But as soon as she said it, he knew. Whatever this was, whatever she was, this was only the beginning. Chapter 5. Unleashing the Wolf. The scent of blood hung thick in the air. Kaden sprinted through the dense underbrush, the shadows of the forest stretching long beneath the moonlight. His breath was even, controlled, but his pulse hammered. Something was wrong, very wrong. The summons had come just minutes ago. A frantic report that rogues had reached the northern border, that wolves were injured, that the pack was under attack, but something about it didn't sit right. Kaden had patrolled the northern pass earlier that day. There had been no signs of rogue activity, no shifts in scent, no tracks leading toward their land. And yet, the alarm had gone up, the scout sending word that the border was in chaos. It felt too perfect, too timed. His wolf snarled inside him, pacing the edges of his control. Hurry. As the trees broke apart, the scent of charred wood and iron filled his lungs. Smoke curled from overturned torches. Bodies littered the ground, some groaning, others ominously still. His wolves, his pack, his vision sharpened. He didn't stop running until he reached the clearing, where several warriors still stood locked in battle with a handful of rogues, or not rogues. Kaden skidded to a halt, his instincts screaming at him to look closer. These weren't outsiders. The scent was all wrong. It was familiar. Pack wolves. His chest clenched. He didn't recognize all of them, but he knew enough. A few from the Northern Patrol, a couple of enforcers from Isaac's faction, and there, standing off to the side, as if this was all an elaborate game, was Isaac himself. His old friend, his rival. Kaden felt his vision pulse red. Isaac stood relaxed, his hands tucked behind his back, surveying the chaos with something that could have almost been boredom. He turned just as Kaden stormed toward him, arching a brow. Took you long enough, Isaac drawled. I was beginning to think you weren't coming. Kaden's voice was razor sharp. What the hell is this? Isaac had the audacity to sigh. Tragedy, really. An ambush. The rogues? They're our wolves. Kaden's growl was low, dangerous. He could feel the shift simmering beneath his skin, the raw edges of his control peeling back. Isaac gave a slow, knowing smile. Are they? Kaden had barely taken another step before one of the younger enforcers staggered forward, panting. Alpha! The boy gasped. They said you would come. His eyes were wild, unfocused. His scent was thick with fear. With a start, Kaden realized he was afraid of him. Then another voice cut through the haze. He's losing control. Kaden snapped his head up to see an older wolf, one of the enforcers, watching him with open unease. Isaac sighed dramatically. I did warn them, he said, loud enough for the gathered wolves to hear. Told them that when you let that thing inside you loose, you don't always know how to stop it. Kaden went still. Isaac smiled, stepping closer. Tell me, Alpha, do you even know what you look like right now? A murmur ran through the warriors. Kaden's breath hitched. His hands, his claws, were unsheathed. His canines, too, sharp in his mouth. But it wasn't just that. The energy coursing through him wasn't natural, wasn't part of an ordinary shift. It was something darker. Something he hadn't meant to release, and Isaac had known it would happen. Had counted on it. The bastard had staged this. Not just the fight, but the entire scene. It was a trap, a perfect, undeniable demonstration that Kaden wasn't fit to lead, that he was dangerous. Kaden's breath came rough. He could feel their eyes on him. Wolves who had once trusted him, who had followed him into battle without hesitation. Now some of them were backing away. Now they feared him. Isaac tilted his head, gaze gleaming. You should probably take a breath, Alpha, before you do something regrettable. His wolf slammed against his ribs, urging him to fight, to strike, to end this, but Kaden knew. If he attacked now, if he gave them what they expected, he'd never undo it. Isaac had won this round. But it wasn't over, not yet. Kaden forced himself to step back, forced his claws to retract, his breathing to slow. Isaac's smirk deepened. Good boy. Kaden turned, barely restraining himself from putting his fist through Isaac's smug face. Not now, but soon. Kaden had always known the pack's loyalty was a fragile thing, that it was not built on blood alone, nor the weight of his father's legacy, but on something more intangible. Belief. And now, that belief was crumbling. He felt it in the way the gathered wolves wouldn't meet his eyes, in the hesitation of their movements, the subtle way their bodies angled away from him instead of toward him. Even those who had been unwaveringly loyal, the warriors who had followed him since the beginning, now stood stiff and uncertain. Isaac had done exactly what he intended. The bastard had turned the pack against him without ever lifting a blade. The whispers began as soon as Kaden stepped back, his body still thrumming with the raw energy he had barely contained, the power he knew they had all seen. He clenched his fists, forcing his claws to stay retracted. He wanted to rip Isaac apart, wanted to wipe that smug, knowing expression off his face. But he couldn't. Not without proving every single one of their fears right. The elders arrived moments later, summoned by the alarm still ringing in the air. Their robes billowed as they approached the clearing, their expressions grave. They did not immediately look at the fallen wolves or assess the scene. No. They looked at him. Kaden ground his teeth as Margaret stepped forward, her sharp eyes scanning the battlefield. She took in the upturned torches, the blood on the ground, the warriors still catching their breath. She looked at Isaac, who stood at ease as if he had merely been an observer to the chaos. And then she turned to Kaden. The look in her eyes was unreadable, but it wasn't trust. It wasn't certainty. "The Northern Patrol reports of an attack," she said, her voice measured. "And yet, we find no rogues." She tilted her head, her piercing gaze like a blade. "Only our own." A murmur rippled through the watching wolves. Kaden forced himself to breathe. "Because this wasn't a rogue attack," he said, his voice steady. "This was staged." Isaac let out a soft, almost pitying chuckle. "Staged?" one of the elders echoed, frowning. Kaden ignored them. His eyes were locked on Isaac, who lifted his hands in mock surrender. "I hate to be the one to say it, Alpha, but you were the only one out of control here." The word hit the air like a stone dropped into a still pond. Out of control. Another murmur ran through the warriors. Isaac turned to the gathered wolves, his expression full of regretful concern. "I don't doubt Kaden's strength," he said. "I don't doubt his power." A beat. A hesitation so perfectly placed, it might as well have been rehearsed. But power without control? He let the question hang. It worked. Doubt seeped into the expressions of the pack like poison into a wound. Kaden felt his chest tighten, because this was what Isaac had been after all along. Not a direct challenge, not yet. No, Isaac didn't need to throw Kaden from power. All he had to do was make the pack doubt. All he had to do was wait for Kaden to prove him right. Margaret turned to Kaden once more. "You say this was staged," she said. "And who staged it?" Kaden's mouth opened. But he hesitated. Isaac was standing right there. He had manipulated every piece of this. He had orchestrated this entire moment to make Kaden look unstable, unfit to lead. But Kaden had no proof. Nothing except his own word. And right now, his word was worth less than the blood soaking the ground. He could see it in their faces. The growing unease, the shift in their stance. Isaac had given them something simple to believe. Kaden was too powerful, too unstable, too dangerous. And Kaden? Kaden had given them nothing but his anger. So he did the only thing he could. He turned on his heel and walked away. Not because he was retreating, not because he was yielding, but because he knew. If he stayed here any longer, he wouldn't be able to stop himself. And that would be exactly what Isaac wanted. Seline found him in the forest, alone, his body trembling with unchecked power. The moment she stepped into the clearing, the air pressed heavier, charged with the unmistakable scent of magic. Of him. She had felt it even before she arrived, the way the ground itself seemed to hum, the way the wind curled unnaturally around the trees. Kaden was on his knees in the dirt, his breathing ragged, fingers digging into the earth as though trying to ground himself. His muscles were taut, his jaw locked so tightly it looked painful, and his eyes, gods, his eyes glowed with something primal, something raw. The wolf was too close. Seline should have walked away, should have left him to wrestle with whatever force inside him was trying to take hold. But she didn't. She stepped forward, slowly, carefully. Kaden. He flinched, a snarl ripping from his throat. Seline didn't move, didn't let the fear creeping along her spine show. She had seen power like this before, had felt its weight, but never had it called to her the way his did. Never had it made something deep inside her whisper, "This is yours to tame." His claws dug into the soil, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven gasps. "You need to leave." The words came out strangled, barely human. Seline ignored them. "No." Kaden let out another snarl, but this time it was frustration, not rage. His control was slipping. She could feel it. The beast beneath his skin was restless, desperate to claw its way out. She crouched before him, her fingers tightening at her sides. "You're not going to lose control." His head snapped up, eyes locking onto hers, and for a moment, just a moment, she swore she saw something beneath the wildness. Something like recognition. "Breathe," she murmured, a sharp exhale. His hands curled tighter into fists. "I can't." "Yes, you can." Her pulse pounded. She could sense how close he was to breaking. Seline hesitated for only a second before she made her choice. She reached out, ignoring the way the air between them crackled, ignoring the voice in her head telling her that this was reckless, stupid. She placed her hands on either side of his face, forcing him to look at her, and the moment she touched him, everything shifted. The power inside him recognized her. Kaden stiffened. His body shuddered violently, but the madness in his gaze flickered. Seline held firm, her thumbs brushing against his cheekbones. "You are not this," she said, voice steady. "You are not a beast." His breathing slowed, just slightly. "You are not what they fear you are." His lips parted, but no words came. Seline felt the shift happen, felt the tension start to unravel beneath her fingers. It was a dangerous thing, touching him when he was like this, but some part of her knew that he wouldn't hurt her, that his wolf wouldn't hurt her. The power that had filled the clearing, suffocating in its intensity, began to recede. Kaden sagged, his head bowing forward, his breathing rough and uneven. Seline didn't move, didn't pull away. She had done it. She had tamed him. But as the adrenaline ebbed, another realization struck her, one that sent ice slithering down her spine. Why had she come here? Why had she felt him, known where to find him? She swallowed hard, her fingers still resting against his skin. She had come to this territory with a purpose. There were things she wasn't telling him, things she wasn't even sure of herself. She had never doubted her own motives before, but now, looking at him, feeling the way her body recognized his, the way his power had responded to her, Seline realized something terrifying. She might not be in control of this, either. Kaden's breath was still ragged, but the wildness in his eyes had faded. What remained was something raw, something fractured. Seline could feel the power inside him shifting, not vanishing, but settling, like a tide that had surged too high but was now retreating, leaving the shore reshaped in its wake. She should have pulled away, should have let him process whatever storm she had just dragged him back from, but her hands remained where they were, cupping his face, her thumbs absently tracing the sharp edges of his cheekbones. His skin was warm beneath her touch, alive with something she wasn't sure had ever been meant for her to feel. "You're still here," he murmured, voice rough. Seline arched a brow. "Were you expecting me to run?" Kaden huffed a humorless laugh, dropping his head back against the tree trunk. "Everyone else does." The quiet admission struck something deep in her chest. The grade, feared alpha, untouchable, indomitable, felt alone. Seline didn't let go. "Then they're fools." Kaden's eyes snapped to hers, sharp as a blade catching moonlight. For a long moment he didn't speak, didn't blink. The air between them was thick, charged, but not with fear, not with danger, with understanding. Her heart pounded in her ribs, and she wasn't sure anymore if it was hers or if it was his, if it was something they had begun to share without realizing it. He let out a slow breath, the ghost of something bitter in his expression. "You don't know what I am." Seline held his gaze. "I know enough." She let her fingers slide away from his face, but only just, trailing down his jaw. Kaden didn't flinch. He didn't stop her. She knew what he saw when he looked at himself. Monstrosity, a loss of control. She had felt it. The moment his power had nearly consumed him. It was not evil, it was not wrong, it was something vast, something ancient. And it had recognized her. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You think this power is a curse, but it isn't." Kaden's throat bobbed. "Then what is it?" Seline tilted her head slightly, as if considering. Then she whispered, "It's yours." He sucked in a breath. She didn't mean to reach for his hand, but she did. And when their fingers brushed, something inside him settled, like a lock finally clicking into place. His gaze flickered to where their hands rested, where his callous palm was now entwined with hers. When he looked back up at her, there was something different in his expression. Something lighter. And Seline, for all her secrets, for all the things she had yet to tell him, knew one thing for certain. This bond between them, it wasn't something she could run from. It was something neither of them could deny. Chapter 6. The Enemy Within. The council chamber was far too small to contain the storm brewing within it. Isaac stood near the center of the room, relaxed, confident, like a man who already knew he had won. The faintest smile played at his lips as he addressed the gathered wolves, his voice laced with something dangerously close to sympathy. "I don't doubt Kaden's strength," Isaac said, letting the words settle like a well-placed dagger. "But strength without control? That's another matter entirely." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The same wolves who had once stood firm behind Kaden were shifting now, uncertainty creeping into their postures. Kaden remained at the head of the table, his knuckles white where they rested on the polished wood. He could feel it, the slow, insidious way Isaac was turning them against him. He wasn't doing it with outright defiance. No, Isaac was too clever for that. He was playing the long game. Doubt him. Fear him. That's what Isaac wanted the pack to feel. Kaden had spent years training alongside Isaac, had once considered him a friend. He knew exactly how he operated. And still, he hadn't been able to stop this. "Isaac," Kaden said, keeping his voice even, though his wolf was already clawing at his ribs, demanding blood. "If you have something to say it plainly." Isaac exhaled dramatically, spreading his hands. "I have no agenda, Alpha," he said, the word a careful mockery. "I only want what's best for the pack. We all do." Another murmur, more wolves nodding. Isaac had been laying this groundwork for weeks, long enough that Kaden could feel the shift beneath his feet. It didn't matter that Kaden had done nothing wrong. Perception was everything. And right now, Isaac was winning. Later that night, after the official meeting had ended, Kaden found himself pacing in the shadowed halls of the stronghold, the scent of old wood and candle smoke thick in the air. Margaret had called for a private council session, without him. That alone told him everything he needed to know. Seline leaned casually against a pillar nearby, arms crossed as she watched him with a quiet intensity. "You're going to wear a hole in the floor?" Kaden let out a slow breath, raking a hand through his hair. "They're talking about replacing me." Celine's gaze didn't waver. "Not officially." He let out a humorless laugh. "No, they'd never be that obvious." She tilted her head. "Isaac doesn't need to challenge you outright. He just needs to let the right people start asking questions." Kaden clenched his jaw. She was right. That was how these things always started. It wasn't about strength. It was about narrative. And right now, the council wasn't just doubting his power. They were starting to wonder if it was safer in someone else's hands. He stopped pacing, his gaze locking onto Seline's. "They won't take the title from me, not yet." Her golden eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Then you need to remind them why you're alpha." The words were simple, but gods, they felt like a challenge. The next morning, Kaden barely had a moment to breathe before one of the guards burst into the great hall, his face pale. "The Eastern Patrol was attacked!" The room went silent. Kaden's pulse kicked up, but he kept his expression blank. "Casualties? 3 wounded, no deaths." A hesitation. "But the scouts say the rogues were different?" Kaden straightened. "Different how?" The guard swallowed. "They weren't running. They were waiting." Waiting. A chill ran through Kaden's spine. Isaac had been pushing him toward the edge for weeks, had been waiting for the moment Kaden lost control, for the moment the pack doubted him enough to start considering alternatives. But now it seemed like something else was happening. Something bigger. Kaden exhaled, steadying himself. The council might be questioning him. The pack might be unsure. But this was a battle. And battle was something he knew how to win. He turned to the gathered wolves, his voice steady. "Gather the warriors. We ride at dusk." No one argued. Because for all their whispers, for all their doubts, Kaden was still their alpha, and it was time they remembered it. Chapter 6. The Enemy Within. The chamber beneath the stronghold was older than the walls above it, older than the council's rule, older than the pack itself. It smelled of aged parchment and damp stone, of secrets long buried beneath layers of dust and time. Kaden's breath was steady as he ran his fingers over the edge of an ancient chest, its iron clasps rusted, but still firm. He and Seline had followed the trail here, a whispered legend passed between the oldest members of the pack, a half-forgotten story about a place where knowledge had been hidden when war threatened to rewrite history. Seline crouched beside him, her golden eyes sharp as she ran her hand over the carvings along the lid. "This script, it's not just old, it's pre-ascension." Kaden cast her a questioning glance. She didn't look at him. "Before the current ruling bloodlines took power, before the prophecies we know now were ever spoken, this is from the age before history was rewritten." A slow dread curled in Kaden's stomach. He wrenched the chest open. Inside, a stack of scrolls lay carefully preserved, wrapped in thin layers of waxed cloth. Seline reached for one, fingers steady despite the weight of what they were about to uncover. She unrolled the fragile parchment and scanned the ancient text. As she read, her lips parted slightly, her expression shifting from intrigue to something more uncertain. Kaden leaned over her shoulder. "What does it say?" Seline exhaled slowly, then read aloud. "The heart of the wolf shall awaken, but beware. For 2 paths lie ahead. One shall lead to ruin, the other to salvation. The wolf blessed with power will not stand alone. One shall rise beside him. A tether, a test, a choice." She stopped. Kaden frowned. "That's not the prophecy I was taught." "No?" Seline murmured. "Because this is the full version." A cold realization settled over him. "They've been hiding this." Seline looked up at him, her gaze unreadable. "The prophecy doesn't say you are the only one with power. It says someone stands beside you, a tether." She didn't have to say the words aloud. They were staring at her. Kaden pushed off the ground, pacing as the implications unfolded in his mind. "This isn't just about me," he said, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Isaac isn't just trying to take my place. He's been playing a much bigger game." Seline was still studying the scroll, her brows drawn. "He's been waiting for this moment, and I don't think he's acting alone." Kaden stiffened. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then reached for another scroll. It was thinner, the ink darker, as if the writer had been in a hurry, desperate to preserve something before it was lost. She scanned the text, then read aloud. Beware the false alpha, the one who would twist the fate of the pack. He who wears the face of a brother, but holds the heart of a traitor. His rise shall herald the return of the war we once buried. Silence settled between them. Kaden stared at the words, his breath slow and even despite the rage curling inside him. They were talking about this. His voice was quiet. This moment, this fight. Seline met his gaze, and Isaac. It wasn't just a power struggle. It wasn't just a challenge for leadership. This was something older, something planned. Kaden clenched his jaw. He knew. He's known all along. Seline hesitated. She set the scrolls down carefully, but she didn't meet his eyes. Kaden narrowed his gaze. There's something you're not telling me. A long silence. Then, softly, I didn't come here by accident. Kaden's stomach dropped. Seline finally looked up, her face unreadable. I came here to find you. His pulse was a drum in his ears. Why? She exhaled as if bracing herself. Because someone else already knew about the prophecy, the real prophecy, and they sent me to make sure it played out the way it was meant to. His body went still. Someone had sent her. Everything. Their meeting, the connection, the bond, hadn't been fate. It had been arranged. Kaden swallowed against the sharp ache rising in his chest. Who sent you? Seline hesitated just long enough for him to know he wasn't going to like the answer. Then she said, the ones who started the war in the first place.
Chapter 7. The Climax. Awakening the Alpha's Heart. The first howl shattered the night like breaking glass. Kaden was already moving before the second howl came, his body instinct-driven, his wolf pushing forward in a way it never had before. The air was thick with the scent of iron, of war. They were here. Isaac had finally made his move. The stronghold gates loomed ahead, reinforced wood and steel that had stood for generations. But no walls, no defenses could stop what was coming. Torches flickered in the distance, casting eerie light across the treetops, revealing shifting shadows. Not just rogues, not just his traitors. Isaac had brought an army. Kaden skidded to a halt at the inner courtyard, where warriors were already assembling, growls and clipped orders cutting through the heavy tension. The council stood rigid, waiting for him, for their alpha, for the moment that would decide everything. Seline appeared beside him, her cloak billowing, her golden eyes darkened with something unreadable. He hadn't spoken to her since her confession, since she had told him the truth, that she had been sent to manipulate him, to push him toward his fate. But now none of that mattered. The war had come to them. Ranulph, his father's former advisor, stepped forward. Isaac's forces are at the north gate. His voice was grim. They won't stop until they breach the stronghold. A steady, controlled breath. Kaden let the wolf rise just enough to sharpen his focus, to drown out the noise, the doubt. He turned to Seline. How many? She didn't hesitate. At least 50. Some wolves, some... She exhaled, her jaw tightening. Some not entirely wolves anymore. Kaden's stomach coiled. Isaac has been using something else, the artifacts, the ancient power. And now it wasn't just a coup, it was something darker. The full weight of responsibility settled over him, not as a burden, but as a force waiting to be unleashed. He had spent weeks fearing his power, fearing what it might do to him. Now he would use it. Kaden turned to the warriors, his voice cutting through the night like steel meeting stone. They think we're broken. They think we'll turn against each other. His gaze swept across the faces of his pack, lingering on those who had doubted, those who had wavered. Let's show them what it means to stand as one. A growl of agreement rumbled through the crowd. Kaden drew his sword, its polished edge gleaming under the moonlight. Then, with a final glance at Seline, at the bond between them that neither of them fully understood, he charged toward battle. The night pulsed with the rhythm of war. Kaden tore through the battlefield, his sword slicing clean through the rogue in front of him, silver flashing under the pale moonlight. Blood sprayed across the dirt. the scent thick and raw. But there was no time to register it. Another enemy was already lunging. His wolf surged beneath his skin, demanding to be freed, to take control. It had been clawing at him for weeks, threatening to consume him, but now it wanted out. Kaden fought back the shift, gritting his teeth as he blocked an incoming strike. The pain of holding the power in check was excruciating, fire burning through his veins, his muscles stretching too tight. He could feel it happening. The breaking point, the moment where he would either control his power or be consumed by it. Isaac's voice cut through the chaos, mocking and sharp. "Look at him! Your alpha can't even control his own damn body!" Kaden swung his sword, but the world was blurring, heat and energy twisting inside him. His vision pulsed black for a moment, his limbs going rigid. No, not now. Isaac was laughing. The warriors around them hesitated. The council watched from the distance, doubt flickering across their faces. The pack was waiting for him to fail. Kaden fell to one knee, the pain unbearable, fire coursing through his bones like liquid gold. His claws lengthened, his vision shifted, his wolf howled in his mind. The power was too much, too vast, too... A hand grasped his, warm, solid, Seline. Her golden eyes burned into his, unwavering. A tether, a test, a choice. Her lips barely moved, but her voice whispered through him, steady and sure. "You're not alone in this." Kaden gasped as the power inside him answered her touch. Not violently, not with destruction, but with recognition. Seline squeezed his hand tighter, her presence like a steady pulse of light, cutting through the storm inside him. And suddenly, he wasn't drowning. The fire inside him didn't consume, it bent, molding to his command. Power unfurled through his limbs, controlled, sharpened. His senses stretched, his hearing keener, his strength boundless. The wolf in him no longer raged. It stood beside him. He rose to his feet, his body humming with new energy, sharper than it had ever been. Isaac's laughter faltered. Kaden met his rival's gaze, rolling his shoulders. "You wanted a real fight?" His voice was smoother now, stronger, his wolf fully awake. "Then come and get it." Seline didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, drawing the two crescent blades from her belt, their edges glowing with ancient runes. The battlefield stilled as the pack and rogues alike watched. As she moved to stand beside Kaden, her golden eyes alight with something both terrifying and beautiful. A rogue lunged, and she met him midair, twisting like a shadow, her blades slicing effortlessly across his throat. Another attacked, but Kaden was already moving, shifting through the battlefield with a speed he hadn't possessed before. They fought in perfect sync, their movements seamless, their energy feeding into each other's. Seline's power hummed through the bond between them, steady and unwavering. Not a weakness, a force. Kaden met her gaze mid-battle, and in that moment something in his chest locked into place. She hadn't been sent to manipulate him. She had been sent for him. Fate, destiny, the prophecy. It had never been about one leader, one warrior, one alpha. It had been about them. Their bond was not a chain, it was a weapon. And tonight they would wield it together. The battlefield was painted in blood and moonlight. The scent of iron thickened the air as Kaden stood over Isaac, his chest heaving, his fingers curled around the hilt of his sword. The energy still burned in his veins, raw and primal, but it was no longer wild. It was his. Isaac lay sprawled in the dirt, blood dripping from his split lip, his breaths ragged. His once perfect composure was shattered, the smirk that had taunted Kaden for weeks, long gone. The pack had gathered in a wide circle around them, the battle stilled, watching, waiting. This was the moment Isaac had been counting on. The moment Kaden would prove himself to be nothing more than the monster he had painted him as. But Kaden was done playing his game. He stepped closer, pressing his blade against Isaac's throat just enough to make his rival still beneath him. Isaac's breath hitched, but he didn't plead, didn't beg. He just looked up, something almost resigned in his eyes. Go on, then, he rasped, his voice hoarse. End it. Kaden tightened his grip on the sword, then stopped. His wolf growled in frustration, but Kaden exhaled, rolling his shoulders, forcing himself to see beyond the blind rage Isaac had cultivated in him. Killing him, it would be too easy, too expected. No, the real revenge, the real victory, would be something else entirely. Kaden lifted his blade from Isaac's throat. No. A murmur rippled through the watching wolves. Isaac's brows furrowed. What? Kaden stepped back. You wanted me to lose control, he said, voice steady, loud enough for the pack to hear. You wanted me to become the monster you told them I was. He sheathed his sword with deliberate slowness. But I'm not you, Isaac. Isaac's lips curled into something bitter, almost a snarl. Kaden turned to the pack, to the warriors, to the council. This was never about me, never about leadership. His gaze swept across them. Isaac isn't the true enemy. A stillness settled over the clearing. Seline stepped forward then, golden eyes sharp as she moved to Kaden's side. She met Isaac's gaze, her voice measured. Tell them, she said. Isaac's breath stuttered. Tell them what? Kaden's voice was a blade. To tell them who you were working with. A flicker of something in Isaac's face, barely a second, but Kaden saw it, saw the truth. Isaac had been a pawn, a willing one perhaps, but not the one pulling the strings. Someone had been feeding him lies, nudging his ambition, setting him on this path. Isaac swallowed, his throat bobbing. But before he could speak, a sharp, cold laugh cut through the air. Margaret. The elder wolf stepped forward from the gathered crowd, her expression calm, too calm. Oh, dear boy, she sighed. You were always too clever for your own good. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Isaac stiffened on the ground, realization flashing through his eyes. Kaden's pulse pounded in his ears as Margaret turned to the pack, her voice smooth, patient, practiced. We all want what's best for the pack, she said. I only did what was necessary to ensure its survival. A chill ran down Kaden's spine. This wasn't just a coup. This had been planned for years, and now the real war was about to begin. The silence stretched through the battlefield like a blade against a whetstone, sharp, expectant, and dangerous. Kaden felt every pair of eyes locked onto him, warriors, council members, the wounded and the wary. All waiting. The night air was thick with tension, the aftermath of battle lingering in every shallow breath. And then, Margaret, the woman he had trusted as an elder, as an advisor, smiled. I did what was necessary, she repeated, voice measured and unwavering, like she was explaining simple logic to a stubborn child. You think leadership is about power, Kaden? It's about legacy. About ensuring our kind survives. Kaden forced himself to breathe, to keep the rage simmering beneath his skin from consuming him. His wolf was awake now, sharper than before, but calm, focused. You used him, Kaden said, nodding toward Isaac, who had gone deathly still beside him. Margaret didn't deny it. Isaac let out a slow breath, his voice rasping. You fed me those doubts? You whispered in my ear when I was too blind to see what you were doing? Margaret arched a brow. And yet you did exactly as you were meant to, didn't you? A murmur rippled through the pack. Doubt. But not in Kaden. Not anymore. It was in her. Margaret flicked her gaze over the gathered wolves, reading them as easily as if they were words on a page. You all think this is treachery? She asked, her voice cutting. You think he, she gestured at Kaden, is what we need? Kaden turned to face his pack, his people. He took in their expressions, the wariness, the exhaustion, the fear still lingering in their eyes. But beneath it, something else was growing. Faith. They had seen him fight, had seen him hold back when they feared he wouldn't, had seen him spare a rival when Isaac had given them nothing but chaos and betrayal. Kaden lifted his chin. I have made mistakes, he said, his voice steady. I have doubted myself, doubted the strength of this pack, but I have never never acted for my own gain. The crowd shifted, some standing straighter, some stepping closer. I stand here now, not because of my bloodline, he continued, sweeping his gaze over them, but because I will fight for every single one of you, because I will not let anyone, rogue, traitor, or elder, decide your fates for you. More murmurs now, but not uncertain, not fearful. Isaac, still on the ground, let out a bitter laugh. You always were better at rallying people. Kaden glanced down at him, because I don't see them as pawns. Isaac flinched. Margaret's lips parted slightly, as if just now realizing she had lost control of the moment. Kaden stepped toward her. You claim this was for the good of the pack, he said, his voice low but filled with an authority that sent a shiver through the watching wolves. But you didn't trust them to decide for themselves. A tense silence. Then a single voice, rough but sure, broke through the night. I stand with the Alpha. Ranulph, the grizzled war captain, stepped forward, planting his blade in the ground at Kaden's feet, a sign of loyalty. Then another voice. I stand with the Alpha. Then another, and another, until the entire pack, every warrior, every scout, even those who had doubted him only hours before, lifted their voices in unison. So Caden's chest tightened, but he didn't let it show. He met Margaret's gaze, his own steady. You wanted a leader, he murmured. Now you've got one. Margaret took a slow step back, and for the first time that night, she looked afraid. The night air was thick with the scent of pine, of blood and sweat, of something new settling over the pack like the first breath after a long-held silence. Haleusis, Kaden stood at the center of it all, the weight of battle still pressing on his shoulders, but lighter now, because he wasn't carrying it alone. Seline stood beside him, her golden eyes reflecting the last flickers of torchlight, her expression unreadable. They had won. The pack had chosen him. But this was the moment that mattered more than any victory. Seline took a slow step toward him, her gaze steady, as if she could already hear the unspoken thoughts racing through his mind. Her voice was quiet, but it carried, grounding him more than anything else had tonight. He met her eyes, and for the first time, there was no fear in what he saw there. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just them. You don't have to stay, he said, voice rough, as if the words themselves pained him. I know why you came here. I know it wasn't by choice. Seline exhaled, a soft laugh escaping her lips, though there was no humor in it. You? Kaden's throat tightened. I came here with a purpose, she admitted, stepping closer, her fingers curling slightly at her sides as if holding herself back. But fate didn't care about that. It didn't care about what I thought I knew or what I thought I wanted. Her fingers brushed against his, a small, fleeting touch, but the bond between them flared, burning in the space between their skin. Seline lifted her chin. It brought me to you, Kaden. His pulse roared in his ears. I don't belong to anyone, she continued, voice steadier now. Not to the ones who sent me, not to the past that tried to shape me. She tilted her head slightly, a whisper of a smirk at the corner of her lips. But if I belong anywhere, her fingers curled around his. It's here, with you. Kaden didn't think. He moved, closing the distance between them, crashing into her like a force neither of them had been prepared for. Their mouths met in a kiss that burned, not soft, not tentative, but deep, knowing, acclaiming, a promise. Seline pressed closer, her hands sliding up his chest, his fingers tangling in her hair. Their bond surged, not just in the way their bodies responded to each other, but in the way their very souls recognized the truth between them. First, he thinks, known in his heart, he had a promise not to drop her, not just mates, partners. Kaden pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers, his breath still ragged. Stay, he murmured. Not because of fate, not because of prophecy. Celine's fingers tightened against his jaw, her lips ghosting over his. I was never going anywhere. The pack had their alpha, and he had his mate. Together they would rebuild, together they would reshape everything, because this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Chapter 8. The New Dawn. The first light of dawn painted the horizon in hues of gold and rose, a fragile promise of peace after a night steeped in blood and betrayal. The stronghold, once brimming with tension and uncertainty, was quieter now, the echoes of battle fading into the crisp morning air. Kaden stood atop the watchtower, surveying the land below. Smoke still curled from the remains of the torches, and the scent of iron lingered in the air. But the worst had passed. The pack had survived, but survival was not victory. His people moved through the courtyard, tending to the wounded, repairing shattered walls and broken gates. There was no celebration, only quiet determination. Wounds would heal, but the scars, both seen and unseen, would take longer. He exhaled, the weight of leadership pressing against his spine. Seline was already awake. He could feel her before he saw her, the familiar presence settling against his senses like a steady drumbeat. She walked toward him, her dark cloak brushing the stone floor, golden eyes, sharp but laced with exhaustion. "You need rest," she murmured, stopping beside him. Kaden huffed a quiet laugh. "So do you." Seline didn't argue. She leaned against the battlement, gazing down at the pack below. "They're looking to you now." "I know." She studied him, the way his hands curled against the stone, the weight in his posture. "You think they doubt you?" Kaden was silent for a long moment. "Not anymore," he admitted. "But I doubt myself." Seline tilted her head slightly, as if considering. "You led them through the fire," she said at last. "And they followed you out of it." He met her gaze then, and for the first time, he allowed himself to see what she saw. Not just an alpha, but the leader they had chosen. The pack was healing, and so was he. Seline reached out, lacing her fingers with his. "This isn't the end, you know." Kaden smirked, squeezing her hand gently. "No," he agreed. "It's just the beginning." And as the sun rose over their land, he knew, no matter what came next, they would face it together. The great hall was quieter than usual, no shouting, no tense debates, only the flickering of torchlight against stone and the steady, expectant breathing of the wolves, who had gathered. They were waiting. Kaden stood at the head of the room, his shoulders squared, his hands braced against the long oak table where the council once held dominion over the fate of the pack. But the council had been fractured, its oldest voices silenced by betrayal, its remaining members unsure of what came next. That uncertainty had once plagued him too. Not anymore. Seline stood just off to his right, her golden gaze unwavering, a silent pillar of support. Kaden let his fingers press into the wood as he exhaled. "We rebuild," he said, voice steady, carrying through the hall. "Not just our walls, not just our strength, but our pack. And not as it was before." A murmur, some nods, others wary, hesitant. He pushed forward. "For too long, we have relied on traditions that served the few while forcing the rest to obey without question." His eyes swept across the gathered wolves. "That ends now." His words settled over them like a shock of cold air. "We will no longer allow the council to hold absolute power over our future," he continued. "The pack chooses its leaders, not bloodlines, not ancient laws written by wolves who never lived in the world we do now." Ranulph, the battle-worn warrior, narrowed his eyes. "And who does choose then?" Kaden met his gaze. "All of us." More murmurs now, some uncertain, some intrigued. "We are strongest when we stand together," he said. "When we choose each other instead of being told who we must follow. The days of blind loyalty are over." He let the word sink in before delivering the final blow. "If anyone wishes to challenge me for this vision, they are free to do so." Silence. Not a single wolf stood. Celine's lips twitched, just barely, in amusement. Kaden leaned back, crossing his arms. "That's what I thought." A slow rumble of agreement rolled through the hall. Ranulph smirked, shaking his head. Brave words, Alpha. Kaden inclined his head. Braver actions to follow. Because this was only the beginning, and he intended to see it through. The air in the great hall felt different now, less suffocating, less burdened by old grievances and silent power struggles. For the first time in years, the pack was listening. Kaden could feel it in the way they leaned forward, the way the tension in their shoulders had begun to ease. Not completely, not yet. But this was the start of something new, and Seline stood beside him, a living symbol of it. She wasn't pack-born. She wasn't bound by the laws they had followed for generations. She was other. And Seline shifted at his side, her golden eyes scanning the room, reading the wolves around them, as though she could see the battle still waging inside them. The weight of loyalty versus the fear of the unknown. They had fought for their survival, but now they had to decide how to live. Kaden turned to her, speaking not just to her, but to everyone. This pack cannot survive if we keep closing our gates, shutting out those who could strengthen us. He let his gaze sweep over the warriors, the elders, the families who had called this stronghold home for generations. We do not thrive by clinging to the past. We thrive by evolving. A few wolves shifted uneasily, but Ranulph nodded once, arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. Kaden inclined his head towards Seline. She has proven herself in battle. She has fought for this pack as fiercely as any of us. And she has challenged me in ways none of you ever dared. Seline smirked slightly at that, but she didn't interrupt. Kaden exhaled, his voice steady. She is not just my mate. She is my partner, and I will not lead without her. A murmur rippled through the gathered wolves, some skeptical, others resigned, but then one voice rang out above the rest. I stand with the Alpha, Ranulph declared, stepping forward, his sharp gaze locking onto Seline. And with the one who fights at his side. Another wolf echoed the sentiment, then another, until the hall was filled with the sound of agreement, the chorus of voices weaving together into something unbreakable. Seline met Kaden's gaze, something unreadable flickering behind her golden eyes. Then she turned to face the pack, her pack now, and inclined her head. I'm not here to replace what was, she said, voice strong. I'm here to help build what could be. And as the last remnants of the past crumbled to dust, as the pack accepted the future that had already begun to take root, Kaden knew this wasn't just the start of his rule. It was the beginning of something far greater, and together they would shape it. Beyond the stronghold walls, where the torchlight faded into the depths of the forest, a figure stood, cloaked in the embrace of the trees, silent, watching. The pack was celebrating inside, the sounds of cautious laughter and murmured conversation slipping through the night air. Wounds had not fully healed, but the battle was over, for now. But this stranger knew better. Their hood was pulled low, obscuring sharp, knowing eyes that flickered with something ancient, something hungry. They reached into their cloak, pulling out a small object, its surface gleaming dully under the sliver of moonlight, a medallion, the same one Isaac had carried. The figure turned it over once, thumb tracing the worn sigil carved into its surface, a symbol older than the pack itself, older than this land. And then, as quietly as they had come, they melted back into the trees, leaving nothing but a whisper of unease behind them. Kaden sat on the steps leading down from the great hall, the cool stone solid beneath him. The night was quiet now, the scent of blood and fire finally fading from the air. Seline was beside him, her shoulder just barely brushing his, her warmth grounding him in ways he hadn't realized he needed. He turned his head slightly, watching as she tilted her face toward the sky, her golden eyes reflecting the stars above. You thinking about leaving? He asked quietly. She huffed a soft laugh, shaking her head. Not a chance. He smirked, but there was something more behind it, something real. Good. I wonder how I could, or speak, even, as Julian answered. Good, Seline glanced at him, then, her gaze searching. You still don't trust it, she murmured. And this piece. Kaden exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. I trust us. He looked out over the stronghold, over the remnants of what they had built and lost. But I also know peace never lasts. Seline studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then we'll be ready. Her certainty was a quiet thing, steady and unshakable. Kaden felt something loosen in his chest. He had spent so long carrying this alone. Now, he wasn't. He reached over, threading his fingers through hers. Seline squeezed back, unwavering. Together. A cool breeze rolled in from the mountains, stirring the treetops, whispering through the stronghold's open gates. The dawn was approaching, washing the world in the quiet glow of something new. But deep in the woods, where the shadows ran darker and the past had yet to be buried, something moved. Something waited. And though Kaden and Seline stood on the edge of a new beginning, though their bond was stronger than ever, they both knew this was far from over. It was only the beginning.